Welcome everyone to the Boathouse, which has a much better view than the Octagon, I think. And who knows, an equally good talk. Thank you for coming all this way, Helen. Helen is the Education and Outreach Officer at the National Museum of Ireland. And she was appointed there in 1997, and she's worked on all the public and schools programming, exhibitions and partnership projects with the National Museum through the Decade of Centenaries. So she's been at the coalface, you could say, of all the work on the Decade of Centenaries. And she's going to talk about the work that the museum did over that period, which kind of connects in quite well with the panel discussion yesterday about the kind of non-academic involvement with all the subject matter and the controversies and everything. Over to you, Helen. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks for having me. Just to say it's a privilege to be here and to share a bit with you about the museum's public and schools engagement programme. As Victoria said, I'd have to say I'm a bit of fish out of water because normally I'm on the side that Victoria's on, booking people and planning events. I'm not usually doing the speaking, so bear with me. I called the talk Pathways to Participation, which is the title of the book. And if you come along to the talk, there's one free for everybody who's here. So I'll give you one later. I've handed out ones already. The aim of the book really was to just document the breadth and the depth of our public participation programming through the decade, to capture and reflect the experiences of those who participated in the programmes across the 4 sites of the museum. And it's a beautiful book. There's a series of essays and reflections by a broad range of people who have in one way or another participated with the programme. So just here. So I'm drawing on the publication, but this really is my personal take on our programmes relating to the decade. And although the programmes were delivered across the 4 sites of the museum, I'm focusing very much on the site that I work at, which is Collins Barracks, where the Decorative Arts and History collections are. And just to be sure, I suppose people here that you know what I'm talking about when I say the Decade of Centenaries. This is a brief timeline of the kind of key centenaries of the decade. And for those who are more familiar, I know there's lots of centenaries I've left out, but these are the ones that were most relevant to the museum's collections and which concerned us in programming that we were developing. But I hope it helps to set a context. It's also, it reflects the collections that we have. So the museum as a national cultural institution had a really significant role to play in putting the exhibitions on display that would interpret for the nation some of the key centenaries, such as the 1916 Easter Rising. And Proclaiming the Republic exhibition formed a key element of the nation's commemorations of the centenary of the Easter Rising when it opened in 2016. But there were a lot of other key exhibitions as well. It's interesting to note that the collections themselves kind of reveal something about what we have collected to remember. You can see clearly the largest collection of associated material culture is by far the Easter Week collection. That collection began the year after the Rising and has grown to more than 15,000 artefacts collected over the last 100 years, largely through donation and a smaller number through loans and purchase. Whereas the museum's collection of objects associated with the War of Independence and Civil War is a fraction of that number, which again also reveals something of the difficulties around this history that we began to unpack during the decade. And the collections relating to the struggle for women's suffrage is also even smaller again. And arguably, maybe up to recently, this was because this was history we had overlooked. One positive outcome of the decade, however, might be that we've begun to see more discoveries and donations relating to these previously overlooked or more difficult histories. So it's interesting just to see what we want to kind of remember and commemorate. And some commemorations maybe are, to paraphrase George Orwell, are more equal than others. One notable point to make here is during the decade, the museum has received donations, and some have come directly as a result of the engagement programming that we ran. For example, in 2018, we got a donation of an Irish Women's Franchise League Votes for Women badge, similar to the more well-known one seen here, which belonged to Francis Sheehy Skeffington and worn by him when he was shot dead at Portobello Barracks during Easter week 1916. And in 2014, the museum received a donation of an incredible photograph album belonging to Lieutenant Andrew J. Horn from his daughters, Margaret and Patricia Horn, who were two amazing women. They were in their 90s when they turned up at a conference we held in February 2014 on World War I commemoration and memory, and approached us really excitedly afterwards, looking to speak to our curator, Lar Joy, about donating this album, which they had kept carefully for decades. Lieutenant Horn had been a medical doctor serving in Gallipoli in 1915 to 1916, and his photograph album documenting this time and his subsequent service during World War I became a key artefact in the exhibition about the Irish in World War I, entitled Recovered Voices. And his album also inspired tours, workshops, and some really key projects that we ran, including a schools project, Gallipoli 100, which I'll be talking about later. In addition to the exhibitions that the museum curated from the collections, we mounted 7 exhibitions which the education team either curated or supported or collaborated in some way. And they're just highlighted in a kind of different colour there, you can see them. These included a nationwide community-created 1913 tapestry project led by SIPTU and the National College of Art and Design. I don't know if any of you remember that, but it was an absolutely amazing, I didn't include a slide, I'm sorry I didn't, but it was an amazing project and really from the sort of ground up. We also were involved in a partnership project with the Design and Crafts Council, which commissioned designer Alison Keneally to create a collection, a beautiful collection of clothing inspired by the Easter Rising. And then we also collaborated with fashion students from the Limerick School of Art and Design on clothing garments inspired by uniforms in the Soldiers and Chiefs exhibition entitled Stitches in Time. When I look back, if you ask me what was our experience of the Decade of Centenaries, on one level, I would describe it as a roller coaster. The early years in particular were a whirlwind of activity and a non-stop rush to get things done. Projects, conferences, school resources, tour scripts, workshops, events, each required careful planning, development, delivery and evaluation. The level of activity the decade generated for me and the little small team I work with is illustrated through these statistics. And like the little mouse in the illustration, sometimes as one centenary followed the next, we were running to keep up with ourselves. But behind all this busyness, my colleagues and I had a vision for how we as museum educators would approach these key events in our history. And just what I talk about for a moment is what informed our programming for the decade. While the exhibitions were the starting point for all our programming, there was a set of values underpinning our planning. And just a quote here from the American museum educator and writer, Elaine Heumann-Gurian, who for me beautifully articulates the role of a museum as a trusted institution, an inclusive space where diverse histories can be explored in all their nuance and complexity. My colleagues and I, including the head of education, Lorraine Comer, who's editor of the Pathways publication, who led our team across the 4 sites during this intense and exciting period, had shared a conviction of the museum as a space for dialogue, exchange and sharing of knowledge and experiences where different groups and communities can have opportunities to engage with issues that connect with them. The values we identified in planning our programme were to be accessible, inclusive, authentic, diverse, provocative and democratic. We were also aware of the complexities and difficult histories that surrounded the centenaries, and this was evident at the very first conference of the decade that we planned in 2012. Entitled Understanding 1916, Approaching 1916, we invited speakers to explore the question of how should Ireland commemorate the then upcoming 100th anniversary of the Rising in the context of that and other centenaries. And those attending were also encouraged to leave comments through a kind of a post board and a post box at the back of the room where we held it, the conference in the museum. A number of common themes emerged from the day, not least the desire to commemorate the Rising in a more nuanced way than had been the case on previous anniversaries. Many participants expressed, you can see some of their quotes there. Many participants expressed that the complexities of Irish history of the time, with many Irish involved in World War I as soldiers in the British Army, needed to be acknowledged. The need for commemorations to be in the context of the diversity of Irish society was also articulated. Another strong theme was the question of the involvement of children and the stories of ordinary people, civilians, and in particular women involved in the Rising needed to be included in any commemorations. And the recent developments in digitisation, enabling the greater accessibility of archives, such as those at the Bureau of Military History, was another theme, as was the desire that commemorations should involve local history and heritage groups. The repercussions of the banking crisis and the bank bailout loomed over the discussions. So those debates and discourse of that day gave us plenty to think about in terms of how we would shape our programming in the coming years. The ideas and aspirations expressed at that conference were actually not surprising for us, and they were in tune with the times and aligned very much with the museum's own vision at that point. A few years earlier, in 2006, the Soldiers and Chiefs exhibition had opened at the museum, and this exhibition, curated by Lara Joy and Siobhan Pearce, amongst others, was ambitious in its scope and interpretation. The gallery, dealing with the period 1913 to 1923, aimed to tell the history of the Rising and of soldiers at the Western Front as it happened during those years. And you can see, I hope you can see it okay, this is an 18-pounder gun. The artefact was deliberately placed down the middle of the gallery with the story of the 1916 Rising on one side and the story of the Irish in World War I down the other. And that was very deliberate. You can even see it's a little bit subtle, but the exhibition designer had put cobblestones on one side, depicting sort of the cobblestones of Dublin, and sort of a surface that doesn't look like mud actually anymore. Maybe it did. It's fading now, but just to give that effect, that feeling. So in this way, the display supports and amplifies that idea that these histories were happening in real time at the same time. The exhibition also focuses on individual stories of ordinary people, including children, some very intrepid children caught up in those extraordinary events. And the focus on individuals was also coming out of the opening up of those archives I mentioned through digitisation and accessibility online, and is a theme, I think, in this conference. Luke Gibbons, in his essay from the Pathways publication, reflects that the digitisation of archives opened access to the hard copy of history like never before. He argues that this acceleration of the global throws local awareness into relief, calling precisely for strategies of looking at the overlooked, gathering and collating knowledge passed down through generations or previously siloed in archives which had not reached wider publics until the present day. These archives have been such a powerful resource for historians, educators, and those interested in family history from the Decade of Centenaries. And my sister Kate, who's here, will be talking later about our grandmother, Helen Beaumont, whose witness statement you can see here in this slide. When the 1911 Dublin census was made available in 2007, I couldn't wait to look up my family's census form. But I was not prepared at all for the feeling I had on seeing my great-grandmother's signature. Unusually, as a widow, she was the head of the household. You can see her, I don't know if you can see her signature at the bottom there. It was a kind of a shock in its immediacy, how it connected me with her when I saw it for the first time. And I'll be honest, I actually started to cry in my office, sitting at my desk. It really hit home to me how we can be connected in that way through a document or object. It was a quite physical reaction I had. So to just in the lead up to the Decade of Centenaries, we also had been working with artists in partnerships in a range of ways. Our experiences through partnerships such as this one, called Moving Statues in 2011, had shown us the value of these kinds of collaborations, how artists can bring different perspectives and insights, make history more accessible and provoke fresh insights and make it fun. Moving Statues was an ambitious intergenerational partnership project between the museum and a school from inner city Dublin, Larkham Community College. with an older people's sort of daycare centre, which is across the road from the school, the Lourdes Daycare Centre, with actor and director Michael Murphy, Poetry Ireland and the National College of Art and Design, a community agency called Localise, and the City of Dublin Education and Training Board. It's a very complicated partnership. Young people from the college developed a play with the older people from the Lourdes Daycare Centre with Michael Murphy, inspired by the 6 statues on O'Connell Street, all men. And they created their own versions of the statues. As you can see, they're giant-sized papier-mâché statues, plus a wonderful chatty character called Maisie, who interviewed each of the men. And this play was performed for the public over a weekend in November in 2011. So in planning the Decade of Centenaries, the values that informed our programmes were to invite artists and other collaborators to provide alternative perspectives and a range of entry points, to be rooted in the collections of the museum, and to create spaces where our audiences could question and share knowledge and experiences with people at the heart. We wanted the museum to be a space and create the conditions to make that space that encourages and seeks new perspectives and insights on old histories, interrogating accepted histories, enabling new ways of seeing, looking and understanding. We wanted to be a questioning and a listening museum, a dialogical space where complex histories are shared, examined and explored with rigour and nuance. So in this next part, I don't believe I've left. Sorry, my handling things. Oh no, they're in my bag. Sorry, it's okay. It's all right. Apologies. I have them here. Sorry about that. Have them here. So in the next part of my talk, I'm going to focus on some stories that I hope illustrate how these values informed our programming and demonstrate how they shaped our Decade of Centenaries programme. Sorry about that. And the idea that the power of objects to connect us with each other and our histories and people from the past, and the power of objects to embody that nuance and complexity and reveal multiple perspectives, which was so central to our programme. So I'm just going to pass this around. Okay. This is called a non-war service badge. It's one from the museum's handling collection of objects. I acquired it back in 2014. I got it on eBay. I've got a few of them on eBay. You can get them on eBay. So there is one that is in the museum's collection, and it actually belongs to this woman here. The museum's collections database records that on the 16th of February 1976, Florence Lee, who was then called Mrs. Florence May Ross, gifted a number of items to the museum. Florence Lee had been a munitions worker in World War I. In 1976, she donated her on-war service badge, a studio portrait, which depicts her in her munitions factory uniform. And you can see, if you look closely, she's wearing her badge on her uniform just there. Her donation also included a munitions factory certificate from the Dublin Dockyard War Munitions Company and a series of 4 photographs of Florence in a group with other munitions workers. These items have been on display in the museum's Soldiers and Chiefs Gallery since it opened in 2006, mentioned earlier. The museum label with these objects says, "The war offered Florence Lee an amazing chance to improve her economic situation. As a dressmaker's apprentice, she had earned a paltry 2 shillings a week. In March 1917, she became one of the 200 women making artillery shell casings in the Dublin Dockyard Munitions Factory. During doing this skilled work, Florence earned about 50 shillings a week. She must have been proud of her contribution to the war, since she saved a number of photographs and souvenirs from this time, eventually giving them to the museum." It's hard to read the writing on the certificate, but it says, part of it says, "She has been employed on the manufacture of high explosive shells, acting as a general attendant in the test room. She has performed her duties in an entirely satisfactory manner and is to be commended for patriotic enthusiasm in this work. A good, steady worker." You can also see her signature at the bottom of the certificate. For me, again, it's a connection with her, like the one I had with my great-grandmother. And it's also just interesting to note that Florence lived on Tritonville Road. I don't know if any of you know Dublin, kind of its Irish town. I actually live around the corner from there now today, and it's very near where my great-grandmother would have lived. And I kind of imagine maybe that they may have met, because they would have been living in that area around the same time. Florence's story told through her objects, features in our guided tours on World War I and a tour entitled Revolutionary Women. She also features in a virtual tour that we made entitled Bonnets, Bandoliers and Ballot Papers, which was originally written as a gallery tour in the museum, but which during the pandemic was adapted and developed into a virtual tour. And you can check out the tour on our museum website. In that virtual tour, we juxtapose Florence's story with quotes. And this one by an anonymous woman who described how she feels about working in a munitions factory in Belfast. And I think it's really quite kind of powerful, the quote. She talking about what it's like to think for a moment. And when you go back and look at Florence, if you see those photographs and look how happy she is with her friends, they really are happy. They're lovely photographs. But then when you think about what they're actually making in the factory, it's that, quite powerful. I have to move on because I'm worried about time. But then this is another one from a nurse from Donegal, which we also feature in the tour, which speaks about her experiences at the front during World War I. The power of Florence's objects, supplemented by photographs and contemporary witness statements, help us to have a really meaningful understanding and empathy with her. And questions like we'd ask in the tour is, what must it have felt like to have so much more money, to go from that little amount every week to having loads of money? How did Florence feel? What do you think she did with the money? How did she feel about the work that she did? She looks like she was happy, but did she have that kind of reflection about, making arms to kill people? And what was it like to go back maybe after the war as well, like so many women did, having that power and then suddenly back to the home, back to being a seamstress, back in your box again, after the war. So the next object is a belt, which belonged, I'm going to talk about this one too a little bit. I don't have a belt to pass around, unfortunately. This belonged to an Irishman, a volunteer in the British Army, whose name is T.F. Gill. We don't know what the T or the F stand for. He's just recorded in the museum's database simply as T.F. Gill. T.F. Gill's belt is on display in the museum's Recovered Voices exhibition. He was an Irish volunteer who in 1914 answered the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, John Redmond's call to join up to further Ireland's cause by fighting for the freedom of small nations, and he joined the British Army in 1915. Even though he was in the British Army, he carried this Irish volunteer belt with him throughout the war, and he gathered souvenir badges and buttons from the men of the regiments he met as he served before returning in Ireland on demobilisation in 1919. And some of the badges are listed on the museum's records. Include Australian Commonwealth Military Forces, Gordon Highlanders, Grenadier Button, Middlesex Regiment, 2 Canadian buttons, Royal Irish Dragoon Guards, the Royal Army Medical Corps, London Irish Rifles button, and so on. T.F. Gill donated his belt to the museum in 1966. We talk about T.F. Gill and his belt in our guided tours. He exemplifies the idea of this history being complex and not straightforward. And sadly, there's no oral history or interview with his donation, but I think his object speaks for him. Nowadays, we would interview somebody, and get more sort of, I think we understand that information is the gold, really, But so he's kind of, his silence as well says something too. Artist Joe Caslin was drawn to this artefact, and it featured in his large-scale mural, which went on display in the museum's Clark Square in 2017. Caslin, who's known for his large-scale, these type of drawings, chose to focus on this piece and its accompanying short film on the theme of mental health and illness stigmatisation. At a conference that we held at the museum in the same year, which explored health and social impacts of museums, Caslin spoke about this artwork. He said, drawing from the example of the 1916 volunteers who sacrificed their lives for a reimagination, this piece looks at those who offered themselves to transform their country in a different way today. These two figures are grounded and set in a pose of mutual support. Should one move, the other would fall. Even in their crouch, their moment of quiet comfort, they are poised to rise. And referencing the belt, Caslin said T.F. Gill's simple action of placing various national emblems together as a joint insignia is powerful and worthy. The object also resonates strongly with me for a different reason. I was reminded of TF Guild's collecting of these badges a year later in 2018 when we began a partnership project with Pave Point, the Traveller and Roma Centre in Dublin, and glass artist Roisin de Butler, who was an artist in residence with us during 2018. In this project, we brought traveller women and settled women together to learn the craft and heritage around beady pockets. This is a traditional item of clothing for traveller women, worn up to about 30 years ago. The pockets are like flat handbags and hold valuable personal items like money, sewing kit, in those days, tobacco, and maybe jewellery, other rosary beads, whatever, those kinds of very sort of precious items. These beautiful and useful garments were the focus of the workshops, where older women from the traveller community generously shared their heritage, traditions and craft with younger travellers and settled women. In the museum space, over a series of workshops, there was a meaningful and genuine exchange of knowledge and experiences, which was really very significant. The beady pockets also sparked, I have to explain beady pockets. I haven't explained it in this. The idea is that traveller women, when they passed each other, maybe stayed and then moved on, they would give each other a button or a bead. And so they exchanged the beads. I've just realised I didn't explain that. They exchanged the beads with each other. So you built up a collection of beads on your pocket from women that you might have met on the road. And so in a way, it's just like what TF Gill was doing. So it's just, for me, that resonated. The beady pockets also sparked rich connections with the museum's clothing and jewellery collections and in the power of objects to tell stories. There was a resonance too with the centenary in 2018 of some Irish women getting the vote in the Representation of the People Act. For those women campaigning 100 years ago, pockets were symbolic and important in the struggle for equal rights. And this felt significance in the context of the continuing struggle for travellers' rights and equality of opportunity and representation in the museum and in contemporary Irish society generally. The virtual tour that I mentioned, Bonnets, Bandoliers and Ballot Papers, was adapted from a tour we had developed in 2018, marking the centenary of Irish women getting the vote. When the pandemic struck, we adapted it to an online tour, which is accessible. I've already said that, sorry. This tour explores, I suppose, the changing role of women at the end of the 19th century into the first 2 decades of the 20th century through the Decade of Centenaries. And this just brings me to another object, which I'm going to pass around. And it's on this object, not this object, but one like it. Again, this is another eBay purchase. This was, one of these was on display in the Proclaiming a Republic exhibition. I'm going to ask, I have here in my talk, does anybody know what this is for? It actually says on it what it's for. Yeah. It's handily, it's very obvious. It's a toffee hammer. It was in a display case in that exhibition. I don't know if anybody was at Proclaiming a Republic, but there was a collection of objects that all had been found in the aftermath of the rising on O'Connell Street. In 2020, during the first lockdown, we made a decision to make a virtual tour of the Proclaiming a Republic exhibition, in part because we didn't know at that time how long the lockdowns were going to continue, and also because the exhibition was due to close anyway. And this was going to be the first time in decades that the museum would not have an exhibition on the 1916 Rising. We were aware through audience research and anecdotal feedback how important this exhibition was to Irish audiences and to international visitors coming to Ireland. So we saw an opportunity to provide a new learning resource for schools and other audiences, and one which could be sort of long-term sustainable. We wanted to keep the kind of conversational energy that we would have on a guided tour and have that feel in the virtual tour. So we filmed with guides talking to each other rather than one guide presenting to camera. So here are 2 of our guides, Sheila Robinson and Shannon Callahan, talking about the toffee hammer as one of the stops on the tour. And this is for primary schools. In the tour, we talk about how poverty was rampant in Dublin in 1916, with an estimated 26,000 families, or approximately a third of the population of Dublin, living in housing which was deemed unfit for human habitation. Sheila references the writer James Stephens from his book The Insurrection of Dublin, who I quote here. Very many sweet shops were raided, and until the end of the Rising, sweet shops were the favourite mark of the looters. There was something comical in this looting of sweet shops, something almost innocent and childlike. Possibly most of the looters are children who are having the sole gorge of their lives. They have tasted sweetstuffs they have never toothed before and will never taste again in this life. And until they die, the insurrection of 1916 will have a sweet savour for them. And, you know, it's different viewpoints, empathy, you know.
The sugar rush afterwards.
Yeah. So the principle or value of questioning everything was core to our approach in planning programmes, whether that be in how we structure tours, which encourage guides to ask questions of tour participants, or in how we shape a conference aiming to interrogate accepted histories and bring fresh insights and perspectives, or in planning a project with the aim of creating the right conditions or space for different viewpoints and perspectives to be explored and shared. A major project for the museum in the lead up to the centenary of the Rising was the establishment of a panel of guides who I've already mentioned. Primarily, they were engaged to deliver tours of this Proclaiming a Republic exhibition. This was the first time the museum had engaged such a group of freelance facilitators, bringing together a diverse group of people who had the skills to deliver tours of this exhibition to a range of audiences, including primary and post-primary schools. The role of the museum guide is one which is only recently being kind of recognised as a key profession in museum learning and engagement. Tour guides who connect with our visitors face to face are in the unique position to create the right environment for tour participants so that the objects they see, learn about and sometimes touch transform their lives in some way. As I've mentioned, that conversational and interactive approach is at the foundation of how our tours are structured and how our guides and educators are coached to deliver workshops and tours. One teacher who we worked with, Adele Fitzpatrick, her school worked on the Gallipoli project with us, and I'll be mentioning it at the end, highlighted how this was key to her students' confidence in leading their learning. And she stressed the importance of how the museum guides and educators structured in a workshop, encouraging students to share their opinions and thoughts, and how the educator kept coming back to why. She noted how the students definitely began to question things more. The actual and virtual tours we devised for the 1916 exhibition explored the theme of choices. In asking questions, what would you have done? Who would you have joined up with? We encourage students and young people in particular to empathise with the protagonists caught up on a range of sides in the run-up to and during the Rising. And through this kind of questioning approach by guides, we also aim to convey that such choices were complex. And for some, there was more than, definitely, I know me, there's more than one answer. It was possible to want to fight in World War I and see Ireland gain its independence, like T.F. Gill. Or equally, it was, you know, there were those who saw the fight for women's suffrage as more urgent than the cause for Ireland's self-determination. Encouraging a self-directed inquiry approach is a central theme in a workshop that we also kind of would have been central to a lot of the projects during the decade, called If Things Could Talk. And I love this slide because I just love this little boy's total, he's holding a shoe. It's from our handling collection, and it's a great object. It really, we've two of them, but it really brings out the imagination and thinking who might have owned it. We ask young people in the workshop or older participants to think like curators and make choices and decisions about object selection while looking for evidence and clues about those same objects. In this workshop, there's no right or wrong answers. It's just all about exploring the objects, thinking about how they might have been used, who might have owned them, and what meanings they might have held and hold now. Through programmes such as the Reimagining the Decade Symposium, which we held in February 2020, on the 29th of February 2020, I remember, and 2 weeks later we were in lockdown, we actively sought and encouraged new research. In this instance, the call out was for recent or new graduates to present their research on themes relating to the decade. A member of our guides panel, historian Dr. Declan Brady, who you saw earlier guiding a group of students in the 1916 exhibition, presented a paper focusing on alternative perspectives to the traditional interpretation of artefacts in that 1913-23 gallery that I spoke about earlier. His proposal to present in the gallery rather than in the lecture theatre was important for us and a factor in our including it in the programme, which explicitly asked researchers to present in alternative ways if they wished, for example, through podcast, video, or in the galleries. In his talk, Declan drew attention to the way exhibition design had presented objects such as the 18-pounder gun that we talked about earlier. He also interrogated the display of Liam Lynch's uniform and Michael Collins's coat at the end of the exhibition. Both of these young men in their early 30s, former comrades in the War of Independence, but opposing leaders in the Civil War, were shot and killed in action within 7 months of each other. In looking at how the space between these two displays conveyed a real distance between the opposing sides in the Civil War, Declan encourages us to consider what inhabits this liminal space. As he explained in his paper, the space between the two displays is as important as the displays themselves, allowing us to see the tragedy of both deaths, what caused them, what the men represented, and the legacy of that division for future generations. The potential of artists to bridge distances or provide an intervention or even disrupt brought relevance and meaning to our programming during the Decade of Centenaries. And we worked with a wide range of artists and designers like Joe Caslin, who you saw earlier, Alison Keneally, Janine Davidson, Roisin de Butler, theatre companies like Carnation Theatre or the immersive theatre company Anu, shown here, writers including Dermot Balger, and composers and musicians such as George Higgs and Robbie Blake. At the start of 2021, the museum was invited by the Department of Culture, Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media to participate in a significant partnership project, funding artists' residencies at the museum and at other cultural institutions, the National Library of Ireland, the National Archives, the Military Archives, and beyond 2022, Ireland's Virtual Record Treasury project. Following a call out to artists, in which the museum explicitly, we were, I think, different from maybe the others, we explicitly sought an artist with a socially engaged practice, and we commissioned artist Anthony Haughey to work with us. Since 2021, Anthony has co-created a series of artworks in response to the decade, with a range of audiences, including this artwork entitled Address for a Cuma. In this project, Anthony collaborated with the Nwane Jutu African Women's Group. They're a group of Nigerian Irish women to design a dress that fused Irish and Nigerian cultures. The vision of the museum's parent department, Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport, Media, should be acknowledged, as the support that they have gave to this project, I think, was really courageous. But especially the generous time allowed, which was 2 years, has meant that Anthony has been able to really go deeply into the collections and also with the communities that he has worked with. At the heart of this design was the melding of, in the print of the dress, was the melding of ancient Irish Ogham with Nasibidi, which is a 4th century Nigerian Igbo language. It was a central aim of the residency to engage new audiences. And for many of the women who participated in this project, it was their first time in the National Museum, and it was a brilliant day. These women all came in their traditional dresses. They do, when they do these kind of, they often wear dresses all in the same, made out of the same material. And they came to the museum, got all dressed up, and did a kind of a song and a dance in Clark Square. It was amazing. And I took them around the clothing and jewellery gallery, and we kind of shared stories about dressmaking. And but as I say, it was the first time that many of them were there, had ever been there. And as artist in residence, Anthony's most recent project is one called the Young People's Assemblies, which took place between January and March of this year. In this project, he invited 5 schools to participate in what he describes as deliberative democracy to contribute towards a manifesto for a future Ireland. The 5 schools who came from the north, south, east and west of Ireland took part in workshops at school to develop their ideas for their manifestos, and then came to the National Museum of Ireland Archaeology, where we held this in the ceramics room, which you see here. It's a room called the ceramics room at the National Museum in Kildare Street, and presented their manifestos at Parliament-like assemblies, which all took place at the last week of March. This is where the Seanad sat during the Leinster House refurbishments between 2017 and 2019. So holding these assemblies here was very significant, as only two, and I have to say locked doorways away, the Dáil sits, and we could hear the bell that would call them to come to vote going off all the time while we were conducting our assemblies. The students presented their speeches on a wide range of issues of concern to them. These included housing and homelessness, the climate crisis, the refugee crisis, transport infrastructure, racism and the rise of the far right, sexism in sport, healthcare, mental health, suicide awareness, social media and the Irish language. Each assembly had an invited speaker, historian or a public figure who addressed the young people at the start of their assemblies and kind of set the context. These included the presenter and author Flora McCarthy, comedian Martin Beans Ward, and historian Professor Laura McAtackney. Haughey filmed the assemblies, and this footage will form part of a video artwork which will be shown at an exhibition on his residency, which will open in December this year. Haughey's aim and ours in this project is to give voice to younger generations and a platform to respond to and explore emerging issues of today and how they can be addressed now and in the future, just as young people 100 years ago were imagining a new Ireland at the end of the decade in the early 1920s. All the people I've mentioned in this presentation, like Florence Lee or T.F. Gill, who in civic acts donated their precious objects to the museum, or those who participated or facilitated in our projects. This is what the museum ultimately means to me. People and their stories expressed through objects and the meanings we invest in them. The museum is only truly alive when people are there to respond, to give meaning to these objects, multiple meanings which continue to change and evolve. The next couple of slides are chosen to convey my conviction of and commitment to the museum as a space where people can share knowledge, experiences, recognise differences and commonalities. This one from 2018, when the room that the young people's assemblies were held in, when it was taken over by the Seanad, who in turn gave the museum permission to hold a series of public events in 2018 to mark the centenary of the Representation of the People Act. This image shows one of the three events, the others being celebrations of music and poetry with connections to women's suffrage. And here is an example of conversational learning that takes place in the museum. Curator Brenda Malone gave a tour of the museum's arms store and talked about the weaponry used in the War of Independence and the Civil War. This event is part of our Culture Club programme, which is a partnership with Dublin City Council. It's a free monthly programme of talks, tours, demonstrations. And if you're ever in Dublin, come up, they're great fun. And they involve tea and chats at the end of a tour when the best conversations happen. And I just think the picture is great because we've a gun on the table and a plate of biscuits. And I think, only in the museum, I think it's great. And Brenda's an amazing explainer. And what's very important to us with guns, we've done tours of the armoury with young people as well. And they tell you more about an A47, because they watch all the video games or whatever. But it's really important to talk about objects in the real, what they do and what they can do. So, yeah, it's done very respectfully and seriously. But it is just funny to say the biscuits with the gun. And here is a panel discussion as part of that conference I spoke about on the social impact of museums, where we asked project participants to speak about their museum experiences and what the museum meant to them. And that would be a really critical element of the way we work with audiences and communities. It's very important that their voices are heard and listened to. Now, just the next couple I just wanted to fit in, really, because I love them. This is a project that we did with local schools in partnership with the Technological University of Ireland, or TUD, much easier to say, in 2016. This is a life-size papier-mâché representation of Countess Markievicz. You may not have recognised her. Made by students, featured in an exhibition displayed at TUD in their entrance lobby, along with handling objects from our collections. We would have loved to put actual objects, but we didn't have the insurance. So we gave them handling objects like the toffee hammer and the On War Service badge, and also other artwork that they created, which came out of a research project that all the local schools did into what happened during the Easter week in Dublin 7 in our locality. And this final image from the museum's collection, another one I really wanted to show you, it features in our virtual tour, Bonnets, Bandoliers and Ballot Papers, and you can hear curator Sandra Heise talking to our guide Sheila Robinson about it. It's a letter that was sent to Countess Markovitz. You can see the address, I hope you can. It says Holloway Jail. I think it conveys so gently and yet so powerfully how women were simply not there. You can see that the letter from the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, is addressed to Sir. It's letting her know that the Parliament is going to sit just after she would have been the first woman ever elected to the British Parliament. They just couldn't alter the template. So, it's just Sir. I think it says so much. It says a multiple of things. It's an amazing object. So you can listen to Sandra, look up the tour and listen to Sandra talk about it. And lastly, just my personal highlight of the decade, I think probably. In 2014, the museum received an invitation to participate in the Gallipoli Centenary Education Project. That was a UK-based partnership project. The aim of the project was to encourage learning about the Gallipoli campaign and enable participants across a range of countries to share experiences and exchange views. We collaborated with 5 schools from across the country over a year, culminating in a conference at the museum where the students presented their research on the soldiers who had fought in the Gallipoli campaign 1915 to 1916 on both sides of the battle lines, and explore how the campaign has since been commemorated. Many of the 15,000 Irish soldiers in the British Army at that time who fought at Gallipoli were members of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers who had been stationed at Collins Barracks, where the museum is now situated. So it's very often think about them when you're walking through the arches. Most of the participating schools had attended a news PALS at Gallipoli play. I don't know if anybody had been to it, but it was incredible. And the schools participated at the pilot stage of the play at the museum. And they also came to the museum, the schools, for workshops where they researched soldiers' experiences at Gallipoli through the photographs taken by Lieutenant Andrew Horn, which you saw earlier. Students presented their research on Gallipoli through PowerPoint presentations, readings, poetry and songs. Art and projects were displayed around the room. One school screened a film that they'd made. Another presented on Gallipolopoly, a board game invented and created by the students. Gallipolopoly. This project had impacts beyond 2015. The following year, in March 2016, the UK partners invited us to take part in a schools conference in Birmingham. With funding support from the UK Gallipoli project and their respective schools, 2 of the students from Trinity Comprehensive in Dublin and a group from Gael Coláiste Curie attended the conference along with their teachers. 2 of the museum's team also attended, including myself. The conference featured presentations from schools across the UK and Ireland, as well as presenters from Australia and Turkey. In teacher Adele Fitzpatrick's words, it was mind-blowing. It was a brilliant opportunity for the students to present their research alongside their peers from other countries. This experience, in Adele Fitzpatrick's view, had a very big impact on 2 of the Trinity students, with one of them, and she says, the one that we never thought we'd see stand up in front of a crowd, going on to study at 3rd level. So that, for me personally, because I had taught at that school about 20 years ago, that meant a lot. It's a school where the students face masses of disadvantage and their climb to get to Leaving Cert is like going up a cliff. And we presented at that conference alongside students from schools such as Harrow, who talked about Harrow and Winston Churchill in their bit, and I felt our guys held their own, and they really did. They talked about all the research about the men who had, some of the, the guys, the pals, if you like, who had left Collins Barracks. I think that kind of what is most evident to me is how much of what impacted in the decade was what came from the ground up. And I hope I've shown maybe a bit of that in this talk, while being supported by the establishment of the expert advisory panel of historians and the government funding at national and local level. I think the momentum has largely been ground up. I think also the fact that, say, schools, like every school in the country, did something on 1916 during that year. And I just show a picture of my son who is at the Mount Street. We had to go with them. He was doing a project, like all kids. He was doing a project on history in his local area, and that's the Mount Street Bridge commemoration. So I think in 2016, more than 145 people visited the Proclaiming a Republic exhibition, including almost 10,000 students who took guided tours of the exhibition. And the visitor numbers at the museum continued to rise right up until the pandemic. I also think it might be possible to look at generating a movement or creating momentum around other issues that are critical and remain unresolved, such as the housing crisis or the climate crisis. Some of the issues that, the young students who participated in the Young People's Assemblies articulated. I don't know, but I'd ask the question, can we do this again for issues like that to raise greater awareness and spur ourselves into action? Because I think we really all came together in 2016. Finally, the museum has gone through a transformation in the last 10 years, and it's really exciting that we've just launched a new strategic plan that has community engagement at the heart of it. I was interested to note in Friday's Irish Times, historian Dermot Ferreter, in an article reflecting on the decade, said, a strong sense of community engagement and buy-in was surely one of the positives of the decade. And I couldn't agree more. That's it. I just finish on a poem that Gary Granville included in his essay in our book. And for me, it really embodies the work that we do as museum educators. It's about the journey, not worry about the destination, if you like, to put it in a teaser way. So,
Thank you.
I don't know if you have any questions. Thanks.
We've got about 5 minutes if anyone's got any questions. I don't think we need a mic in here.
I don't know about your question, but I really related to what you were saying about the power of an object to relate, and you were talking about your grandmother. And to my shock and horror, one of the objects that came down to me through my family was a badge worn by my great-grandfather at a unionist rally in Belfast. I had always thought of myself as some kind of typical Irish Catholic traditional nationalist, and to find that this was also part of my heritage was a real eye-opener, and has really, really influenced me in, that whole complexity issue. Nothing is as linear and simple as it feels.
I think we come from that kind of a mixed background or whatever. I think everybody, when they scratch the surface, we're actually, and I suppose that's what we're trying to do in the museum, is just we're all people. And
we talked last night about, the multiplicity of Irish places.
Yeah.
And that really, so
during the Decade of Centenaries, I remember my colleagues and I sat around a table in our office. I worked with probably mostly Irish people, but I remember one of my colleagues, Edith Andrews, she's now a curator at the museum, but she comes from former East Germany. And she's great because she gives you that sort of outsider view as well. But actually, we all sat around and said, what does being Irish mean anyway? And actually, to each of us, it meant, another colleague was from Belfast. But each of us had even if we're both from Dublin, we still have a different view of what Irishness is. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow on there, I just say that was a brilliant talk.
Thank you.
Really, really
Thank you.
I'm really interested in the subjectivity versus the objectivity that you strive for the subject.
Yep.
And yet, obviously, following on from the really interesting discussion last night about the lack of conversation sometimes across our island, I'm intrigued when you did the timelines there. There didn't seem to be a huge amount on the Orange perspective and the Orange experience. And for people up in Northern Ireland, the establishment of Northern Ireland, when I hear Kate Hoey now talking about our little, although I don't share it, that's their country.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, is it very difficult? I mean, do you see it in terms of our museum down here as a way of expressing more what we talk about down here and leave that to the Ulster Museum, or is it very difficult to deal with those kind of
Well, we didn't deal with the covenant because we didn't really, say that anniversary. Or we may have, we probably had a talk or two. I can't, to be honest, we probably did. Can't remember. But we did have, in Proclaiming a Republic, we did have a space at the start where we talked about all the different traditions in Ireland, and we had an Orange Order collar with all the badges, and we talked about very much, and that what I referenced it there is like all the different places that you could come from at that particular point in time, and unionism was one of them. So we would have included that in the tours. So you know that there were all these different viewpoints, and each of them.
Is that the aim? I mean, from your point of view, is it to try and bring? Is it possible to do that objectively? Do you think?
Well, we have to start with the objects. So we talk about the objects, but then we also try to, I suppose, get people to empathise with the objects. And we do that by maybe talking about the people who own the objects. Yeah. Does that make sense? Am I answering your question?
Exactly. Yeah, you just have to present what you have, I suppose.
Yeah. I hope I'm answering your question. But we do try to, but there's no, like, in a way, we can't go and do something that we don't have in the first place, I suppose. But we certainly tried to show the sort of very much 360 sort of rounded view of where Irish people were coming from. And we you know, we've had, I suppose as well, we've had, you know, like again in the Soldiers and Chiefs exhibition we dealt with, and that was the first time that had been done. You're showing World War I, you're showing 1916, you're showing them at the same time, because they happened at the same time. Previously there was this Irish Fight for Independence exhibition on its own, kind of in its like hermetic kind of gallery. And other history. Do you know what I mean? And we didn't do that. We wanted to show that these things, and it was possible for you to be both or one or the other. I hope that.
Neither.
Yeah, or neither.
Just a question. I think access was the first of the characteristics you mentioned, and obviously not everyone can get to Dublin, not everyone can get to the exhibitions. And you've done fantastic work, as you mentioned, on putting stuff online, and now you have your weekly. I think it's a weekly newsletter. From the museum and so on. I'm just curious, I mean, the power of the physical objects being mentioned. Yeah. Have you ever thought of taking some of these exhibitions and bringing them down to other locations, Limerick, Galway, Cork, that sort of thing?
That kind of a more, I'm not dodging it, kind of curatorial question, but like there is, material is loaned out to local museums all the time. So, but you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Alison Keneally exhibition, we wanted to travel that. We had an ambition to travel that exhibition after it was displayed in 2016, but we just actually didn't have the people and the money to do it. Because like I said, I was moving on to whatever was happening in 2017. So we kind of, we met it to talk about how we might do it. And then we had to say, sorry, we're not going to be able to do this, because we're very, I mean, I work with like just 3 or 4 people. That's the size of our team. It's very small. So, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the museum would be, that's something that we're, like with our new statement, our strategic plan, is to be more, try to get out more with and partner more with local museums.
No, I know that because of grandchildren going into the museums in Dublin, and I must say it makes a huge difference. And the Cork Public Museum now did a good job. That's why I didn't put Cork on the list of places. But I mean, they have a good collection and they display well. Yeah. But I do feel it's...
Oh no, it's very well made point. Yep.
Thank you, Helen.
Thanks,
a
Victoria.
question to end on. Sorry, I get the privilege. You showed a slide about the number of objects relating to all the different, the kind of 32 suffrage objects, whatever. Presumably, the Decade of Centenaries has encouraged people to donate more.
It has, yeah. They did a call out, and they did a call out at the start, in the run up to the Proclaiming a Republic exhibition. I think, and for objects relating to World War I, And I think I off the top, I don't have numbers of what came in, but I picked 2 there that I know came in through the kind of public programming.
That's good.
Yeah.
And the sweet shop story in Easter Rising. That's just...
It is, isn't it? It is, and and you just think they would never have it as sweet, and it's nice in the tour because our guide Shannon, we filmed a little piece on O'Connell Street, and where she's standing at a sweet shop, and so it sort of brings it, tried to bring it to life or whatever. So check out the tour. Yeah. It's the primary school version, not the public one. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.